Hello everyone, Brickosaurus227 here, and welcome to the Nerf Archive Season 3, Episode 4. And today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite in-strike blasters, the Nerf in-strike Stampede ECS 50. We'll find out about that. But here's the thing, I am not very knowledgeable on this blaster because I haven't used this one that much. It's broken, I need to fix it, but I absolutely love this blaster for the week I got to use it several years ago, and I haven't fixed it since. I really should fix it. But thankfully enough, we have a guest appearance today who's going to talk about the Stampede. And I don't think there's one person more qualified to talk about the Stampede than Captain Xavier himself. Yes, today's guest appearance is by Captain Xavier, and he's going to be talking about the Stampede, the impact it had on the hobby, and what it has to offer today. So without further ado, let's get started.
Hello, I'm Captain Xavier, and I would like to thank Brickosaurus for inviting me to do an episode here on Nerf Archive. I, of course, requested to cover the Nerf Stampede ECS, as it was my very first Nerf blaster and is still one of my favorites. The Stampede was released in 2010 as part of the N-Strike series, and has the distinction, as far as I can recall, of being the only magazine-fed electronic spring-powered blaster that Hasbro ever produced. What we would now call an AEB. Now, there were other electronic springers, but they were not magazine-fed. The Vulcan was belt-fed, and the Speed Swarm, Swarmfire, and Power Bell were revolvers. It did come with a number of other attachments. It did have this nifty shield that connected to the rail, which, depending on your club's rules, could have some significant advantages. And it had this rail-attached spring-loaded bipod, which also would act as a foregrip, which was just the coolest thing back then. It came with 60 streamlined darts, the very pinnacle of foam projectiles at the time, though they were quickly replaced by the Elite Dart, which was significantly better. But at that time, 60 darts was a lot of darts. And what was really impressive was that it came with enough magazine to actually hold it all. It came with 3 18-round magazines and 1 6-round magazine for a total of 60 rounds of capacity. And that made this blaster just absurdly powerful at the time for games like HVZ, where you didn't need a whole lot of range, but capacity mattered. The controls were fairly simple. It did have an on-off switch on the side. It did have a jam door, which did have a lock, so if the jam door was even partially open, the blaster would not fire. Magazine release here. It did have magazine locks, so if you didn't have a magazine in, it wouldn't cycle, which is good because you wouldn't want to dry fire this. Magazine release is right there. And then it just had full auto. It didn't have a particularly high rate of fire. It ran on 6 D cells, so it's a 9-volt system. But we did very quickly learn that there were some ways that we could modify it. It is a very complicated system. There is a reason I suspect that Hasbro moved away from electronic springers, and that is that they are far more complicated than flywheelers. Flywheelers are easier to build, there's less moving parts, it's far less complicated, probably much less expensive to build, and so they only ever produced this one magazine-fed blaster. And it is prone to jams and it is difficult to modify, but we persevere. You can upgrade the spring, though if you upgrade the spring too far, you then need to upgrade the gearbox from plastic gears to metal gears. There is still a limit. It doesn't have the largest plunger tube in the world, so there is a finite limit to what you can get out of it. But if you do upgrade it to half darts, you can get it into the 140s, get some decent performance out of it. Firing full lengths, you're probably never going to get quite that much. So there's limited potential for the high performance part of our hobby, but there's still plenty for the lower performance, because this is still a really fun blaster. The whole recoil and the firing mechanism that this has is just very, very tactile and very, very enjoyable. There's a reason this is still one of my favorite blasters. And we are now seeing a resurgence of AEBs. There's a vast majority of really nice ones out there now. It started out with people building a stock that could turn a long shot into an AEB, and now we have things like the Colonel WAF 76 and the Sweetheart Storm and the inverted scales. There's lots of AEBs now, and a lot of them are actually really, really nice. So I'm glad we're seeing that particular technology, that mechanism come back, because it's what I loved about the Stampede. I always loved the recoil and just the general nature of it. So there is what I have to say about the Stampede. Thank you for watching.
Big thanks to Captain Xavier for appearing in this episode of the Nerf Archives. He is by far one of my most favorite Nerf YouTubers and just favorite YouTubers in general. His thrifting videos are probably one of the only reasons I'm in the hobby today. Not only reason, one of the only reasons at the time that I actually stayed in the hobby. And I'm extremely honored to have him on this episode. When I asked him to do an episode on the Nerf Archives, he said yes, and he requested to do the Stampede, in which I was all for, because personally my Stampede's broken and I wanted to do an episode on season 3 anyway for the Stampede, so it worked out great. But what are my thoughts on the Stampede? Well, it's an amazing blaster. One of the big noticeable things about it is just how straight up comfortable it is. Like, they really nailed it. I don't think they've come close, honestly, to comfort, besides maybe the Nitron. The stock is the perfect length. It's the perfect back, like, it's the perfect thing to rest your shoulder on. The grip is a classic N-Strike grip. I'm pretty sure it's like an exact copy of the Recon and Retaliator style grip, which I love. It's one of my favorite grips of all time. There are 3 variants of the Stampede. There is, of course, the N-Strike version. Then there is the Sonic Green version and the Icon version, which is actually updated in performance. Overall, I would totally give it an amazing rating. The Stampede in particular is such a cool blaster, and it was kind of funny that when this released, it was the new standard. It was like how the Nemesis kind of changed the hobby. It wasn't even allowed in some games. That's how overpowered it was at the time. But now it's time for a little bit of a history lesson. So you'll see a lot of times that, like, this will say Stampede ECS, or I believe it was marketed in some ways as the ECS 18. Well, originally, and this is the really cool part, the Stampede actually was the Titan CS50. What does that mean? Well, basically, it used that same drum mech, but they couldn't quite figure it out, and later on it appeared in the Titan, and a little bit, they seemed to kind of figure it out, but it still wasn't that great. But yes, the Stampede was going to have a 50-round drum. As you can see right here in the picture above me, thanks to Out of Ideas for sending this over, but this is the original instructions for it, and it went with a 50-round drum. That's an insane amount of ammo at the time, and if that released and it somehow worked, that would have just been the coolest thing ever. And maybe 50-round drums would have been more of a standard, which would have been cool. But yeah, the Stampede is just N-Strike, like, nostalgia, pure and simple. It was the AEG before AEGs were even a big deal in Nerf. And I kind of miss the style. I would love to see Nerf or even Dart Zone tackle these, but I wouldn't want it to be like the AEG we kind of know from Airsoft. I still want it to have the Nerf feel, and this is definitely like what I think a Nerf AEG or AEB should be. But with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Nerf Archives. Again, huge thanks to Captain Xavier for appearing on this episode. I am incredibly honored, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.